I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. Today's guest is Lily Herman. She's the founder of Get Her Elected, a political network of thousands of volunteers who've offered their skills pro bono to progressive women candidates running for office. And with a record number of women running for office, this is a service that's sorely needed. We also talk about the blue wave and the pink wave in midterms, and we talk about some possible Democratic blind spots. So here's my conversation with Lily Herman. Lily Herman, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
You know, when I was thinking about, when I was preparing for this interview yesterday, I was so excited because I'm so excited to live vicariously through someone who has some distraction and, you know, who's actually doing something to help people get elected. You know, I was wondering if it was like that for you. Has Get Her Elected been kind of a respite for you?
Oh, goodness. It's definitely a labor of love, but which I always tell everyone, but I would definitely put an emphasis on the love part of that. Even the sort of, as I'm sure you know, and have from talking to people, a lot of work is just a lot of mundane work, but it's I think been nice to do that and have it lead towards something bigger. So that's been really, really rewarding.
All right. So tell me about Get Her Elected. What do you do and how did you get started?
Yeah. So on the highest level of what the concept is, Get Her Elected is a group of people who are offering their skills pro bono to progressive women candidates running for office. So what does that all mean? Currently, we have now almost 2,300 volunteers. They have skills that range from everything from writing and editing to graphic design and web design to data analysis and data entry to general fundraising. And the list goes on and on. I mean, I could spend hours listing all of the skills of our amazing volunteers. And what they do is we sort of match them based on tasks that specific candidates have. And that enables us to help those women throughout their campaign. So there's about, at our peak, we had 230 women we were helping. Obviously, that number goes up and down a little bit depending on who makes it through their primary or their runoff. Some women also enter our network later. We already have some candidates running in 2019 and even 2020 who've entered our pipeline. So lots of good stuff going on there. And I guess in terms of how it started, so I've done a lot of work for campaigns and different political organizations over the years. I volunteered for campaigns, worked for them, worked for different organizations, that especially women-centric political organizations. And something that I just sort of noticed over time, long before the election, was sort of this gnawing subconscious problem I saw, that these organizations were phenomenal at getting women interested in running, giving them those first key toolbox kind of resources that they could use. But there wasn't really any built out constructed pipeline for when these women actually filed to run. So a lot of women got all of the support the second they filed those papers. Those teams kind of felt like, well, our expertise is, we kind of have this cutoff, and then women are left alone to run their races, which obviously, whether you're a first-time candidate or like an 8-time candidate, there's always going to be stuff that you have no idea what you're doing, or you're down on support or funds or just need more knowledge, what have you. So yeah, so that was just a subconscious thought. And then how the actual organization came from that is right after the election, I'm thinking about the fact that I live in New York City, which obviously has a mountain of issues, but is much more progressive / liberal than a lot of other places in the country. And I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, which is on or near the Florida-Georgia border. Wow. And obviously I cannot practically fly down to Jacksonville constantly in the midst of all my other work up here to volunteer or help make change there. So I thought, okay, there must be an organization out there that, I can volunteer my skills as a writer, an editor, a digital strategist to a campaign somewhere. I went searching around. I talked to some friends at a variety of organizations. A lot of places either didn't have that, or they had maybe a volunteer list, but hadn't really created a program around it. It was just sort of this bizarre, just sort of email subscriber list. So I said, okay, maybe I'll just get together a couple of friends, like 10, 15 people, and we'll donate some time to a couple of campaigns and call it a day. I sent out one tweet in like December or January of 2016 or 2017. So in that time frame, in the month or two after the election, and I just said, hey, if anyone wants to help liberal, I didn't say progressive, it was like liberal women get elected, send me an email. And I, again, thinking I'd get like 2 or 3 emails and group some friends together. And that tweet alone got me 80, as in 80 emails.
Wow.
So, I'm sitting there on this giant pile of messages, and obviously I'm sitting there saying, okay, I've I've hit some sort of nerve here. And everyone kept saying the same thing of like, I'm in a liberal place, or I just don't even know how to help. And calling my reps, while important, is not the only thing I want to do, or I don't want to just attend a rally once a year or something. So that's, I guess, the origin story of how Get Her Elected came to be.
That's amazing. Actually, that's a really good lesson for anyone out there who's listening and they feel kind of anxiety about something that's happening and they find a niche that hasn't been filled, right?
Absolutely. And my biggest tip to everyone is always make sure the thing that you have in mind doesn't exist already. Often cases it does. I learned this lesson in college. So I went after it for a month or two before putting out that tweet, quadruple checking that I was not about to step on someone's toes or create something that had already existed to the level of infrastructure I wanted. None of that was there. Or there were a couple of groups, but they were very local, very small, and had more specific niches. So you would have, graphic designers in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, helping Wyoming candidates, or, and they're nonpartisan, or whatever it might be. So that's always my biggest thing is I guarantee about 90% of the time, something like what you're looking for already exists. I always say, try it out before you do your own thing, because also doing your own thing is very difficult. So if the infrastructure exists, people are always happy to have really enthusiastic people.
Right. So one of the things that I was confused about was when I read about what your organization did was before your organization, how do people recruit volunteers for these things? Because you offer, like you said, anything from marketing to content strategy and, presumably like a whole host of other services.
Yeah. So typically it's very difficult. One, if you are associated with, there's a lot of, again, amazing organizations. You can get on the list of Emily's List, She Should Run, Vote Run Lead, Emerge America, Higher Heights. I mean, literally the list goes on and on of places that are helping women be inspired to run and empowered to run and giving them those initial tools. So some women would go through those organizations to try and get help. A big issue that a lot of these orgs are seeing nowadays post 2016 is they are swamped. So they are feeling like they barely have the bandwidth or don't even have the bandwidth to do what their kind of core mission of trainings or whatever have you, let alone then help their alums of those programs or the women they've endorsed then find all of these other things. Right. So that's one route that some women went. And we work with candidates who, say like, I know those orgs have the best of intentions, but they just didn't have the bandwidth to help me find someone or whatever, other than maybe putting a call out on these random email lists. So that was one thing. Two, you just have to, a lot of women we talk to before they find us are trying to find people locally. So that's a huge issue. Or they're spending money that they don't have or trying to fundraise to have that money to spend that they don't currently have on these services. So that's sort of, I guess, the two biggest routes I see when I talk to women. And then the other problem is a lot of times you don't know who you're specifically supposed to contact. So you would have women, for instance, who went through some sort of training or program who would maybe reach out to their program training officer, but that person might not know who's specifically running this volunteer list or if that list even exists or what the deal is. So that's also, I think, created some issues in the past.
What's interesting about the political climate that we're in right now? So, you've got the pink wave and you had the Women's March and there's so much energy behind women running. I would think that now, after the 2016 election cycle, that women would be better off, right? In terms of people being there for them and to help run their campaigns. Why is it that women candidates still have so few resources in comparison to the male candidates?
Ooh, where to even begin? So many things to unpack in that question. So a bunch of things. One, Democrats have it a little bit easier than Republican women, but one, there just hasn't been that level of infrastructure, both formal and informal, in terms of networks for women candidates to a certain extent. So obviously, again, I say Democrats have it a little bit easier because they do have places like Emily's List or what have you that are partisan and leaning towards helping them. And I think issue stances align a little more in terms of helping women versus certain other stances by other parties. So I think that's one thing, is that infrastructure didn't exist. Two, you're still, even on the left, dealing with a lot of sexism, misogyny, even from women, just a lot of internalized misogyny where they're coming up with all sorts of reasons to not help other women. I've had some candidates too say that they've had more trouble getting women to support them than maybe people in other sort of identity demographics that they identify with. Wow. So that's always really interesting and always a little bit just infuriating to talk to people about that. So I'd say those are two. And then also, I think there's just within that, people just have a lot, including, I would say, as someone who's on the outside, it is not some sort of, veteran campaign staffer or something who's been doing this for decades. I think there's a lot of very deeply entrenched idea of how the infrastructure and those institutions should work. And again, because women have largely been underrepresented, and then within that different groups of women, there's just not, I think, a sort of push in certain parts of these institutions to really bring women in. So I think that's all an issue. I mean, from volunteer perspective too, I think the issue with some of these institutions is they have the idea of who the ideal volunteer is, and that creates problems. So I think all around, it's just, there's just a lot more to deal with to getting these women the help they need and then helping them run. But I think, especially after 2016, there's been a lot of movement to start building up that structure. But I'm also very aware, as of lots of other people, that takes years and years and years, and in some cases decades and decades, to really actually build out and solidify long term.
Yeah. I was reading recently, Kelly Dittmar. I don't know if you know Kelly Dittmar. She wrote the book about, I think it's called Navigating Gendered Terrain, about campaign strategies when they're crafted through this gendered lens. And in one chapter in the book, she was talking about when women run for office, the party officials or party insiders, right? They determine a candidate's viability, right? And then that determines how much resources they'll pour into that person's campaign, right? But that's a setup for women, right? Because of sexism, right? Just to put it simply, women are deemed to not be natural leaders. And of course, even if that's subconscious, in that sense, they'll just have a disadvantage from the get-go. Yeah,
they'll create a lot of reasons when you get down to it, don't make any sense unless you're being sexist. So even when I would talk to people and to women, I've heard all sorts of infuriating reasons of, it goes back to, there's a chicken and egg problem of, okay, you can't raise money without money, but you can't get that initial money without actually fundraising it. So you'll have fundraisers who say, I can't sign on to give you money until you have this much. Obviously, they all feel that way. And also on top of that, you deal with just also, I think a lot of institutions like predictability, and I think they get very thrown off in a lot of ways by anyone who's unpredictable or unconventional. I recently was moderating a panel through an organization called AWP. They had a conference called Win with Women. At that conference, there was Amanda Littman from this amazing organization called Run for Something. And she made a great point that women in this election cycle are being really, really interesting and not boring with branding themselves as women and as mothers. And you have multiple women breastfeeding in campaign ads. You have women no longer just giving their campaigns, spiel in their ads in a kitchen, baking cookies. They're wearing different outfits that are not the sort of pearl necklace shift dress with a blazer. But I think, though, while that's all great and I think it's awesome and I'm telling everyone to just do it, you have institutions who are really threatened and afraid of that and get really scared. And because they've never seen or had to do anything differently. And so they kind of knew what sort of women candidate would do well in their minds. And again, they would sort of use that thinking to keep a lot of women out. But on top of that, now they don't even know what to do and they can't really control these women. And because they're saying they're not going to fund them, they end up kind of falling flat on their face when those women do well. And they're not the ones who help them get there. So there's a lot of, again, I'm getting a little bit off track here, but there's a lot of these sort of smaller rabbit holes and whatnot you get into as soon as you start digging into what's really going on within these campaigns and with these candidates.
So the thing is that no one talks about is the idea that in some ways, perhaps they're right. So firstly, withholding funding from a woman candidate, because of ideas that are built around sexist cliches, that's never okay. Mm-hmm. But perhaps the calculation, the idea that, there are some communities who may be fine with voting for a woman candidate, those communities may not be ready for someone who completely breaks the mold. And maybe that's just a pragmatic calculation that we should all talk about.
Yeah, I think it's sort of, I think one thing that a lot of people have said is it's important to look at the patterns and the overarching sort of themes we see, but also understanding that we also have to look holistically and individually at every district, every state, every area, et cetera. So so certain women can totally get away with it. Other ones might see some resistance. I think at the same time, though, what we're seeing is it really depends on the women. There are women that everyone counted out in certain communities and they ended up winning, or they, at the very least, they ended up, doing way better, even if they didn't win, than anyone could have possibly imagined. So I think it really depends on the woman. It depends on where they're running. And I think also something that we're really big on at Get Her Elected, and which I tell everyone is one of the biggest questions I get is, do you bring on, candidates or vet them based on viability? And my answer is always no, because I believe that every single woman, especially every progressive woman who runs, regardless if they win or lose, their presence, and regardless of, I think, what, to a certain extent, what that presence is, that makes it easier for the next woman to run. So, there's some women who are obviously going to lose. We've seen some already lose in the primaries so far, but they have shifted the playing field already as is, and they're making it easier for candidates who don't want to fit a mold, and who want to kind of do something different. They're making it easier for those women to do that, even if maybe that candidate themselves didn't necessarily do that as well. I think just the idea of women in these spaces is already revolutionary, even if people don't want to pretend it is, or think that we're in this sort of strange, like, post-gender, like, stereotyping world, which is of course not the case. But I think all of those women are making that sort of difference. And again, it's the shift is so slow. It's sort of all at once, and we kind of forget in the midst of a news cycle where things break every 40 seconds that at the end of the day, the progress of human history is both a very fast thing and yet a very, very glacial, slow process.
Yeah, that's quite profound, actually. So you wrote an article about the California primaries and about how the blue wave wasn't a sure bet. And I've read that in other places too. So why do you think it's not a sure bet?
I think the bigger thing is, so I'm both a very cynical person and a very hopeful person. My biggest thing is I never want people to get complacent. And I think, especially like I said, being someone who grew up in a very conservative area and now lives in a very much more liberal place, and also has family in California and whatnot, I think it's easy if you're in New York or California to say, like, yeah, we got this in the bag, like, great. Or just having someone who is some form of blue is, like, perfectly fine. Who cares? Whatever. They don't have the GOP stamp of approval on them, et cetera. I think the issue with that, though, is that you then run the risk, again, not really focusing on the issues and moving them to a different place. As of course, as a lot of people are mentioning, we're starting to finally see that there is a difference in certain types of Democrats, which has always existed. But I think sometimes there's sort of this feeling or sentiment that just can come around of, well, these places are better than those places, therefore let's focus on the places that are truly terrible and let these other states like California or New York just sort of do them, Yeah. And I think the problem with that is we can say we can do both. So if you are in California and you want to see more progressive policies, don't just stop at, okay, we have a Democrat in Congress. You can try first to see if that person can become much more liberal or progressive on their views. If it's looking like they're not going to budge or they have highly problematic intentions and votes, absolutely go, see who else would be great for that position. That's my biggest thing. I see this happen all the time in New York, where everyone just can get a little bit complacent or just sort of like, well, it doesn't really matter. Even for things like, local elections here. That was also, again, just as someone who never had that privilege for a long period of time growing up in my adolescence, I just find that bonkers. So I'm like sitting here like, at least you guys have Democrats to choose from. Usually we did not. And if we did, there was exactly one. And often, they were not someone great. So then you were stuck with the quintessential dilemma of like, both options are terrible. What do I do? Probably vote for the Democrat, but like, it's just like, oh God. So I think that's where a lot of it's not necessarily saying that's always happening. And there are a lot of great, especially activists and lobbyists and people doing that work and really making sure that those policies are moving forward or they're finding other candidates. But I also talk to just as many people who, are sort of saying, well, it's blue, so not a priority, or like not going to worry about it for a while. And that's where you start to see a lot of issues where people stop paying attention to what's really going on. Right.
That's a dilemma that I have too. I live in Seattle and it's very, 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 liberal as well. And, even myself, sometimes I think, well, I want to focus on, other areas, other states like Texas. Maybe I'll do some phone banking for them and just kind of, not think about the issues in my local area. But I don't know. It is a dilemma. And I'm from the South too, so I get it.
Ah, yes. The Southerners always like, if you were at all liberal and grew up in a real Southern place, it's just that sort of moment of, I get it. Like, yep, it's a time. It was an interesting time in my life.
Yeah, no, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, which, just like miles from the Lorraine Hotel, seriously. Oh. And so, yeah, I get it. The need to escape and then this kind of draw, this connection, to back home, right?
I think it's just an interesting, different perspective. I think there's just also, quite frankly, I've had friends in the Northeast who've said, I don't really know if I even really had to grow up with Republicans. I mean, in a sense of knowing someone well who was a Republican. And I, of course, am sitting there like, That was the vast majority of my class. I have one of my favorite terrible stories to tell is that when I was in high school, I wore Obama Biden buttons on election day in 2008, and a random older like senior or something told me I was a Muslim terrorist sympathizer, which obviously he heard from his parents and from Fox News. But it's like I went there for high school, so really a little bit different. Combined with the fact that I'm Jewish and was living in a southern part of the Bible Belt, it was sort of there's sort of a different perspective there. And I think coming up here, there's been a lot of me having to explain how certain parts of the country work, and not to excuse some of their views or behaviors, but saying, hey, understand the context of what goes around here, or the culture that these people are in, including the fact, one of my other favorite terrible stories is that there are kids in my graduating class who believe that the Civil War should be called the War of Northern Aggression. So, and we're completely unironic about it. So, again, all things to keep in mind in terms of politics. And I always make that point to people who are from liberal areas and stayed in liberal areas and didn't really get actual exposure elsewhere, other than maybe visiting Disney World on vacation or something. It's sort of like, let's be real here about what these areas are like, especially if you're there long term.
Right. I mean, I think my experience was just living there. I think that if you are a liberal family or a liberal person living in the deep, deep South, or, a deep conservative area, my feeling was that people the liberals who were there kind of resigned themselves. They would vote, but but they knew that, nothing would happen. Right. So they kind of resigned themselves to living kind of in this, conservative enclave.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to say. That's what I find so interesting about this election is you have a lot of resurgence where people are really excited. One of my favorite races right now is Amy McGrath's race in Kentucky, where you're just like, Kentucky? She beat out, someone who was asked to run by the DCCC and just had this, obviously amazing viral campaign ad, because she, is a veteran and has done all these amazing things. But it's definitely, I think, a different world in that we're finally seeing a little bit of movement. But I would say similarly too, you have a lot of places where demographics are changing, specifically in the South. I know Jacksonville in recent years has had, it's just a good example, has had a lot of corporations settle down there. Those have brought transplants from more liberal areas of the country and from the South. So I think what's been fascinating, as I haven't been there for many years, living there permanently, is watching sort of, the Democratic swell start. But I think, they definitely have a long way to go, and people in Jacksonville are really excited, but also recognize that they're getting there, but there's still a lot to do.
Yeah. So here's the thing. So why can't people be excited, and, with the blue wave and the pink wave, why can't we be really excited and also pragmatic? Right. And that's the thing about the data for me. So, for instance, some numbers came out, I think last week about, how the women who are running for office have fared. Yeah. And I tweeted that. And I think I posted it on Facebook, and it wasn't received very well. Right. Uh-huh. And I was just saying, it's just data, right? Like, it's data that you should pay attention to. You could also be really excited and energized about these women, but you should also know where our blind spots are too. Mm-hmm. That's something that I don't get.
But yeah, because I'm very, as I've told everyone who knows, again, I'm very cynical and also very optimistic and hopeful, but I'm always sort of a hope for the best and work to see the best happen, but prepare for the worst. Case in point, I was one of the only ones of my friends who I think had really thought through a scenario where Donald Trump won for president. Again, just having been from the South and knowing people who campaigned for him that I went to high school with, I was obviously grief-stricken. It was terrible, but I was, I think, less shocked in that sort of way. But I think similarly, I think using the energy and the momentum we have right now is great. But my concern, which I tell everyone, is I do not want to wake up on November 7th, regardless of the outcome of the midterms, and all the infrastructure is gone, or people say like, we did it, it's over. Or, I hate the term the year of the woman that's been coming back, because I'm like, well, like anything else, every year should be the year of the woman. Like the women, and then within that, we can't just say women. We have to talk about women of color. We need to talk about women with disabilities. We need to talk about single mothers and parents in general. We need to talk about all these different people and what it means to be the year of the woman. So that's always my thing to people is like, well, what are you going to do on November 7th? If we win or lose, what is your plan? And if people are just kind of like, I don't know, or like, I'm just hoping it works out, then
yes,
you need to work harder before the election. And then you need to also consider what your game plan is, I think, in both scenarios when that moment comes.
That's why I think it's so important to not blind yourself to the data, to look at the data, right?
Yeah.
And another thing about being a Southerner, I think that, people like yourself and myself, we could possibly see a scenario where Hillary Clinton wouldn't win because we understand how people in those regions think, right?
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I was just going to say, I was sitting there and I said to a friend of mine who I forgot at the time, was very from the Northeast, went to a liberal college, et cetera. But I made some comment like, he still could win. And here's what I think would happen. Obviously all these terrible scenarios. And she was like incredulous over the very idea. And again, I wasn't saying I hope he wins. Obviously
of course not. Right.
But I was sitting there saying, okay, but I want to emotionally prepare myself, which I couldn't have even done that if I tried. But I was one of the only people I knew up here, especially amongst people who maybe, when I was talking to people who were also from more liberal or accepting areas, I was one of the only people who had really thought through that. And then sure enough, I had some Southern friends who also made similar comments. Were like, I think we need to talk about if America is as racist as we all think and know it to be, and like as sexist and as like just terrible. Yeah. So that was really fascinating to me.
Yeah, not to stay on this topic too long, but I definitely did not feel encouraged when I wanted to talk about the fact that the margins were so slim in so many areas and they were getting slimmer, right? That wasn't a popular thing to point out. But anyway.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely.
I mean, Russians aside and all that other stuff.
Save on Cox Internet when you add Cox Mobile and get fiber-powered internet at home and unbeatable 5G reliability on the go. So whether you're playing a game at home,
yes, goal,
or attending one live, you can do more without spending more. Learn how to save at cox.com/internet. Cox Internet is connected to the premises via coaxial cable. Cox Mobile runs on the network with unbeatable 5G reliability as measured by Ookla LLC in the U.S. 2H 2023. Results may vary, not an endorsement. Other restrictions apply.
You found your person. Now let the Knot help you with everything else. The Knot connects you to the wedding inspo, vendors, venues, and planning tools you need to make your day totally you. Having helped plan 25 million weddings, we've got your back when it comes to every little detail like RSVPs, budgets, and more. Because your wedding comes to life with the connections that matter the most. Get started at theknot.com/audio. The Knot. Let's plan your wedding together.
So I want to talk about Democratic messaging around the blue wave and around the pink wave for the midterms. And I think that there are two goals that are being conflated, right? So the primary goal, of course, is to take back the House and the Senate. And I think that falls under the umbrella of the blue wave. And then there's the secondary goal, which is the pink wave, is to elect more women. And I don't think the messaging around that has been very clear. They're kind of lumped in together, right?
Yeah. I'd say, too, what's interesting of having both of these goals at once. Well, one, it forces especially Democrats to have to think intersectionally to a certain extent, which again, I'm saying that the other problem is that they're not thinking, I think, intersectionally enough, which is another problem. But I think, first of all, a lot of people are upset that they even have to think about women. So that's an issue. And then, of course, you get those people who say, well, what if the woman is like unqualified and the guy is very qualified? Am I a bad feminist? And again, there's a lot. We could spend 8 podcasts on that kind of theoretical question. But I think that's what's been sort of interesting is having to see a lot of people reckon with a lot of their values, a lot of people who said they were feminists having to actually think about what that means in a lot of different senses. So that's been, I think, fascinating. Again, I think just in general, I'm also just very nervous, even women aside, that Democrats will get excited if they take back the House and or the Senate and then stop doing stuff. Or that's honestly my biggest concern is regardless of if women have a breakthrough or whatever it is, I'm just very concerned about what November 7th looks like. And I think too, a lot of, because I work in media, I'm aware of this, a lot of places are starting to at least plan out their 2020, aka the presidential election coverage. And that's also, I think, stressful as well. If you think of it in the context of the blue and the pink wave of like, will we see women running, especially for the Democratic ticket? Obviously, a lot of people are saying yes. And then there's a lot of debate within political scientists and, political strategists and all these different people about if a woman will win very soon in American history or it'll take another 50 years. That's a whole debate. So I think that's been really fascinating to read about. about is that a lot of very smart people disagree with each other.
Right.
And I think the second big thing is obviously a huge issue that the Democrats had for the past, even well before Obama, just decade plus, 2 decades, whatever, is they became obsessed. I would even say further back than that, but they became obsessed with the presidency and didn't focus on having a really great, down ballot slate of candidates. They didn't focus on the pipeline, on the local, state, et cetera level. There's been a lot of emphasis on the presidency. And as we've obviously seen over the past decade, if your, legislative chamber of government is, Satan, that is going to make it very hard for a Democratic president to get anything done. And similarly, if you're trying to really implement stuff and make a difference, a lot of it starts on the local and state levels. So if you don't have people who believe in your beliefs on those levels, you can have the presidency all day long and you will see a lot of communities go backwards. So that's also something that has been a huge concern of mine, is both, what do we do in terms of win or lose, in terms of women getting elected and Democrats taking over the majority in either or both houses, and also Democrats on the state and local levels is another huge thing that I'm always talking about and thinking about. But on top of that, how does that lead to how we're going to feel in 2020? And I think that's a pretty big thorny issue, basically.
Yeah, so much to say about that. So first of all, to your point about, maybe we'll have success in November and then Democrats will just forget about it.
Yeah.
I think the thing is that people don't realize is that we were disgusted in 2007. People have forgotten about that.
Oh, yeah.
We were so disgusted with Republicans and what happened with the war and with Bush in 2007 that there was a book published that was called I'm Sorry. Do you remember? You were too young. I think you were in high school. But there was a book that was published that was called I'm Sorry. I have a copy. I bought a copy a few months ago because I wanted to remember that, where people were taking photos of themselves holding up signs that said I'm sorry to the world for Bush.
Yeah. No, what I'm also, to that point, what I'm fascinated by, one, I'm always fascinated by why we go backwards, and specifically why white people, and even more specifically why white women keep going backwards. Because we can say the same thing about the Bush era, the civil rights movement. What happened? Why can white women just not get it together on a large scale? And on top of that, what I also find fascinating about this era is, especially as someone who's built an entire career on the internet, I'm always fascinated by the internet element and also how that's shaped the group that is, very, very lower, younger millennials. So people like me, who some people, researchers would say that I'm not even technically in the millennial bracket, who knows? But I'm always thinking about that generation that is very tail end millennial. So beginning of the 90s to mid 90s, and then the beginning of Gen Z, which everyone has thoughts on when that begins, but mid to late 90s, early 2000s. Those are the kids who are the Parkland activists and all the other high school activists. Those are the college students. And I'm really interested to see what happens with them or how they react, and can they overcome a lot of issues that have impacted previous generations, especially younger generations, in these moments. So will we be in another 10 to 15 years having another I'm sorry moment? How do we make it so that we're not following this pattern again? And then, when I'm in my late 30s, I'm once again now with children explaining why we're fighting for the rights of all of these people because we allowed terrible folks to retake control and then figured it out way too late. So, figured it out way too late in terms of larger society. So that's also what I think I'm always thinking about in terms of, how did we get here, considering that we felt like we were here over a decade ago.
Right. Yeah. And, one of the things that I don't think is talked about often enough is that, I'm sorry to say this to anyone listening, that we may not get another chance in 2020, right? With the rate at which things are progressing now. And, there's some gerrymandering cases that have been won, but some haven't been won. And there's obviously a focus on, voter suppression. We may not, if we don't make significant strides in midterms, 2020 may just be a very slim option for us.
Yeah. No, I always tell everyone, I'm like, I would love to see what 2024 looks like. That's going to be an interesting year. That's my running joke with all my friends. But I'm just, in general, I'm always very concerned with and I think the stakes are so high, and also needing to make sure that we always remember that the stakes are high, but also not letting that take over and paralyze us from getting that work done is always on my mind in terms of what that looks like. And also reminding people too that, again, don't just be going after the big name glamorous positions. Who are your local reps? Because that is one thing that I mean, you have some races where only 2% of the population votes in local elections. For the Teen Vogue cover story I did recently, I found that in the Las Vegas, I don't know if it was the actual election or the primary, only 2% of people, I think it was 18 to 34, voted in that. 2%. So
Yeah.
I'm sitting there saying you guys can affect everything on that level and build up from there, and making sure, I think, if we do have bad news, or even if we have great news, that people aren't discouraged or also not taking their eye off the ball, and also understanding that there's a lot more they could be doing in ways that would be so easy. Like local candidates is so much, it's still difficult, but still so much easier to get those people into office or get them into appointed positions and all of this stuff.
One of the things that I think is missing from Democrats is the messaging around, so we know what the blue wave is, just kind of generally, right? But messaging around how we will practically achieve that. Right. Like, and as you pointed out, there's still some low turnout in some of these local races. Right. And I just don't have, a list, like a very pragmatic list to follow. What are voters supposed to do to achieve the blue wave?
It's figuring out what you can do to help in the short term. So Get Her Elected is obviously just one of a zillion options. We're great because it's all virtual and remote. So people who don't want to canvass or phone bank or don't have the ability to do so, or for a variety of other reasons just can't get out there to be physically present with a campaign, can do that online and still make a huge difference. I think it's also just, I still have a lot of friends who are not talking to their friends about the importance of voting, and that just appalls me. I had a close friend who admitted to me shortly after 2016 that she had not voted in the election, and after a brief couple months where I just needed a moment to not be outraged, sit her down and actually poke at why. Or figure out how could I make her start seeing the light, understanding that was going to be a long process and that a lot of other learning had to be undone to be able to teach her all of this stuff. I think there's things like that people can do. I think there's also, I always speak towards young people because that's obviously where a lot of my work lies, and I am a quote unquote young person according to the people of Twitter. But I would say a huge one too is, for instance, I think Cosmo did this huge survey or study where they interviewed thousands of millennials, and the biggest thing they heard is that millennials said they didn't know who was running or any of the practical information. So making sure that your friends and family, in addition to you helping out and doing all this stuff, make sure people know what day your primary is, what day the cutoff is to register to vote. Same with the to change your party if you need to. I know there's a lot of party switching going on right now. So making sure that stuff is practically done, and making sure too that people know other races are going on. I was shocked at how many New Yorkers, had no idea that a lot of the New York City specific races are in 2017. They had no idea that there was a New York City election going on. They had not done any research into their candidates, and most people can't even tell you who their local and state reps are. So I think those types of practical things are just as important. And then also taking it upon yourself to be the one to yell at people on election day and leading up to election day. Do you have a ride? Do you know how to get to your polling place? If you're in a state that has those terrible voter suppression ID laws, like what do you need? What's going on with that? Do you know where to access that information if you need to? Those are the types of things that I think people can and should be practically doing, in addition to any other volunteering and whatnot. I'd also say too that just amplifying the issues and what we're seeing, for instance, with the child separation from family separation we're seeing down at the southern border, talking about that and understanding and talking to people why, connecting those dots. Why do we need Democrats in office? Do you absolutely despise what's going on right now and think it's an abomination? Then you need to, in addition to donating, calling your Congress people, et cetera, you need to be prepared to vote in a way that would help those people and help those families. I think a lot of that gets lost in how policy and all of that connects to voting, which sounds really counterintuitive and kind of obvious, but you'd be surprised at how many people have many thoughts, but then don't let it be known at the ballot box and then are shocked when things don't go their way. So I think that's also a big part of it.
So the next time, let's say, we get to 2020, we take back the House and Senate, and, 2020, we have a woman at the top of the ticket. What should we all be doing differently as, voters and as constituents?
Oh my God, so many thoughts. For one thing, let's cool it with the ambition narratives of like, oh no, ambitious women, that's just kind of a thing. Women are ambitious, they are driven, they have things they want to do. I think also just a lot of people need to sit and think before they speak in terms of how they speak about women candidates, in terms of whether it's about appearance or voice tone or any number of things that are often coded for, women or, that sort of sexism. There's a lot of latent sexism that needs to be discussed. I think that's a huge thing. I think also, I have so many thoughts on this. I think it's also just, I'm just sitting here, I'm like, oh, so many things pinging around in my head. I think that's a huge one. I think also making sure we reflect on what went wrong. And I would say the past 2 elections in particular. So you can't just look at 2016. You have to look at 2008 because we still had Hillary and we also had Sarah Palin. And much can be said about Sarah Palin, but there was also some stuff that was not good from everyone. So, and also how I think certain narratives have been portrayed by men in particular post 2008. So we need to look back and say, what did we do wrong in those specific issues? Is it another huge one, for instance, with any Democratic person who's on the ticket or who's won the primary, but especially women, is are you going to support because you really want to see someone better who is not Donald Trump in office? I think that's a huge thing where that sort of virtuous, like self-righteous, I'm not voting unless it's the perfect candidate thing is just not an option right now. And I think we have to also unpack that sort of issue as well. But especially because people seem to have lots of problems, even if they won't say it, with women running or with women who don't have a very almost unattainable pedigree and background and appearance, to win. So I think those are some of the things that we have to start grappling with. But I think a lot of that also ties into not just the presidential election. There also has to be a lot of grappling with, people's own day-to-day issues with women, with sexism. And again, I also loop in women with this. There's obviously a lot of women who haven't really done the work in unpacking whatever hatred they have towards themselves or antagonism towards other women. That's a lot of stuff that just needs to be discussed. And I would also say that's generationally, that has to do, I think, education-wise, there's a lot of rifts, things like that sort of have to be discussed if we're going to not only have women who are running for the presidential race, but, really competitive, potential to win both the primary and the general.
Excellent.
Cool. That was my long-winded response to that.
No, that was great. Well, Lily Herman, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really proud of the work that you're doing with Get Her Elected. I hope everyone volunteers.
Please do.
And I, for one, feel better. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a supporter of the Electorette. Visit us at electorette.com and click on the donation link at the top of the page. The Electorette is now available on iTunes, SoundCloud, Google Play, and Stitcher. Please consider subscribing using your favorite podcast platform. Also, please like us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/electorette. And until next time, keep up the good fight.